Before I introduce the topic and set out the ground rules, let me just introduce the participants. From my right, Mr. Richard Fuld, who's of course Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Lehman Brothers US. Next to him is Kristin Halvorsen, Minister of Finance of Norway. And next to her is Mohammed Al-Jasser, Vice Governor of the Saudi Arabian Monetary Agency. And next to him is Bob Kimmitt, US Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. Next to me on my left is Aleksey Kudrin, who's both Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance of the Russian Federation. And next to him is Mr. Badr Al-Saad, Managing Director of the Kuwait Investment Authority. Next to him is Stephen Schwarzman of the Blackstone Group. And next to him is Larry Summers of Harvard and, of course, former Treasury Secretary. The way we're going to do this is we're going to have very short opening statements in response to questions from me, about 2 minutes each. That should give us the opportunity to have a discussion. We're going to start with the people with the money. Then we're going to start, because that's where it should start, I think. Then we're going to talk to the people who are the intermediaries for the money. And then finally, we're going to talk to the people who are the policy makers. And I think it'll be pretty obvious to you what that order is. Just to remind you, this has become a very, very big topic, $2.5 trillion and counting, and it could clearly rise massively. It's become one of the fascinating features of our world that in the age of global capitalism, state-owned funds have become such significant players, and very recently they have become not only significant but very helpful players. Instead of having to bail out banks ourselves, we have these kind people bailing out our banks for us, which I have to say I'm quite grateful for. Though there's a British bank going, which no one seems to be very interested in. I can't imagine why. Okay, the questions we're going to address are what principles should govern the operation of these funds, from the point of view of both the countries with the funds, from the point of view of the capital markets, and from the point of view of policymakers. And I think one of the issues here, which is very important, is should this be basically handled on a bilateral basis, country by country, or should there be some sort of global deal? I would expect people to address these issues. I'd like to start, and I'd just like to remind the panelists, please keep to 2 minutes in your opening statements. You will have opportunity to return later to the topics, and I do hope to have questions at the end, provided the panel is as wonderfully disciplined as I expect, so get your questions prepared. I'm going to start then with Mr. Al-Jasser from Saudi Arabia. Would you be willing to help us by just telling us a little bit about your funds and what you're trying to achieve with those funds from your point of view?
Thank you, Martin. Good morning, everybody. As you well know, in Saudi Arabia, we do not have a sovereign wealth fund as such, but we do manage our reserves through the central bank, and basically they are to stabilize the economy and to protect it from the vagaries of commodity markets, particularly oil. And I think if one looks at the Saudi experience over the past 20 years or 25 years, will discover that between the year 2000 and the year 1983 and 2002, we had 20 years of budget deficits, and there was at times up to 25% of GDP, the deficit. And that could not have been financed without saving some of the surpluses that were accruing at times of surplus, and then smoothing the economic cycle in a counter-cyclical way in the case of Saudi Arabia. So they were very important for protecting the economy and smoothing out consumption for us domestically, but also helping smooth out consumption globally. I think it is very important, even though we do not have a sovereign wealth fund, it is very important to know that in the case of these surpluses, they have accrued because of either commodity production, let's say oil. We need to provide sufficient oil for the global economy, and at times that may be more than we need for our budgetary spending. So we are doing it to play our responsible role in the oil market, and therefore you have these surpluses and then you have to manage them afterwards. I think we have managed them very well for the sake of our economy, but also for the sake of the global economy. But I don't think for those countries that have sovereign wealth funds that we have seen any abuses or any irresponsible behavior in the global financial markets. I think they had always taken long-term stabilizing role in the global financial markets. I think my colleagues, particularly the minister from Norway, will explain some of that. I think also the transparency issue, it has been raised a lot. I think transparency is like motherhood and apple pie. Who wouldn't want that? But I don't think there has been any difficulties in understanding who's investing where. The requirements for all stock exchanges and all regulatory agencies make sure that whoever invests in any company, that it is well known and that it is monitored and it is compliant with all the existing regulations in each country. If those regulations need improvement, I think that is possible. But we should not look at the sovereign wealth funds as a risk and a danger. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very clear statement, both of why you have the money and what you do with it, and your role in the capital markets. May I now turn to Mr. Kudrin to give a comparably brief statement of how Russia views the role of its money, its funds, in the world economy now.
Уважаемые коллеги, друзья, Россия имеет один из самых больших фондов. Сегодня он больше 150 миллиардов, а к концу года будет больше 200 миллиардов. Его источники связаны с использованием цен на нефть. Мы в виде налога облагаем высокие цены на нефть и формируем стабилизационный фонд. С 1 февраля этого года пройдет реформа стабилизационного фонда, и он будет разделен на два фонда. Фонд резервный, который будет составлять около 10% ВВП и будет страховать нас от снижения цен на нефть, и фонд национального благосостояния, который будет направлен на решение в основном пенсионных задач в долгосрочном периоде. Но я бы отметил, что общего есть во всех фондах. Прежде всего, фонды формируются за счет профицитов бюджетов, причем не только в нефтяных странах. Сингапур, Китай имеют очень большой экономический рост и очень сильный экспортный потенциал. И у них также возникает вопрос об накоплении сбережений, связанные с предотвращением быстрого укрепления национальной валюты или получения инфляции. Поэтому это объективно, и многие страны могут эти фонды иметь. Больше 30 стран имеют такие фонды. Второе. Фонды, как правило, создаются, чтобы быть сохранены для будущих поколений. И таким образом сохранность, надежность размещения является важнейшим его принципом, а это означает, что они должны быть очень сильно диверсифицированы, и диверсификация создает достаточно понятную ситуацию по вложениям этих фондов. Эти фонды вкладываются в долгосрочный период, и поэтому они не связаны со спекулятивными операциями. В этой связи фонды, как правило, способствуют сглаживанию колебаний рынка и способствуют стабилизации рынков и ценных бумаг. Если посмотрим на фонды, то примерно 60% фондов направляется в инструменты с фиксированным доходом. И только остальная часть направляется в акции и другие активы, которые сегодня только несколько фондов имеют такие активы, как недвижимость. Поэтому думаю, что фонды сегодня играют положительную роль на рынках. Опасения по поводу политической мотивации их вложения сильно преувеличены. Больше того, думаю, что опасения, которые связывают с этими фондами, скорее создадут другую проблему, серьезный риск ограничения движения капитала, и этот риск сегодня стал более реальным. Вложение 3 триллионов средств фондов благосостояния не вызвало проблем на рынках. Наоборот, они были нужны, они были востребованы. А ограничения, которые стали вводиться сейчас в США, готовятся в Евросоюзе, могут стать реальной проблемой при движении капиталов. Спасибо.
Thank you very much. Very clear and strong statement too. Very helpful for our future discussions. May I turn now to Mr. Al-Saad?
Kuwait probably is it's probably the oldest sovereign funds in the world. In 1953, which is 8 years before the independence of Kuwait, Kuwait established Kuwait Investment Board in London. That was something like 55 years ago. The objective was to transfer non-recurring assets, highly volatile, which is the oil, into a well-diversified portfolio. All is that is to create a social stability in the country. And I think it has worked well during the Iraqi invasion in 1990, when probably most of the oil wells when Kuwait has been occupied by Iraq, and probably most of the oil wells has been burned. For 3 years, Kuwait does not have any source of income. No, not at all any revenues. And probably 80 to 85 billion US dollar has been spent from the fund to finance the budget. So this is the reason why these funds has been created. I think there is a lot of worry about the sovereign funds, but I guess all these worries are not in the real cases. All of them are either in assumptions or in expectations. But really, there isn't any real case about the fear of the fund. Kuwait has been a shareholder in Daimler-Benz since 1969. It has been probably one of the most stable shareholder in this entity. It has been a shareholder in British Petroleum since 1986. It has been also one of the most stable shareholder. In terms of governance, I think Kuwait Investment Authority has probably one of the most regulated and governed investment authority. I go to the parliament probably three to four times a year, and I go to the committees of the parliament probably 6 to 7 times a year. So it's really well governed body. For 55 years, we never had politically enforced decision for our investment. All our investment has been in commercialized basis. We look into the bottom line. We don't look to anything else. And also, we have been passive in all our investment. We haven't played an active role we haven't been an activist in all our shares. So I think all this fear which has been created these days about the sovereign wealth funds has no basis and has no real case to build on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I say you sound like the perfect investor from the management's point of view, at least. But I'm sure we'll hear more about this later. The final representative of the people with the money, is Mrs. Halvorsen from Norway.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to give you some key information about the Norwegian pension fund. The size is about 380 billion US dollars. That corresponds to our annual GDP, and around 15% of our GDP is transferred to the fund every year. We are a financial investor. We have a limitation of 5% ownership in every single company, and our average ownership is 0.5%. The fund is owned by the Norwegian people, but I am representing them. But I have a mandate from the Parliament, and the investment guidelines are given by the Ministry of Finance. But the manager of the fund is the Norwegian Central Bank, and we never interfere in the operation of the fund. There is a broad political consensus on the fund's construction and the guidelines for the fund. The fund is established to manage the revenues from a non-renewable resource, the oil and gas sector of Norway, and to the benefit of future generations, and of course to avoid shocks in the Norwegian economy and ups and downs connected to the price and production of oil and gas. The fund is integrated in the state budget, and we have a fiscal rule saying that 4% of the fund's capital can be spent on the fiscal budget every year, corresponding to what we expect is the real return on the fund's capital. The fund is an extremely long-term investor. In principle, we are going to be shareholders forever. It's managed with a very high degree of transparency. Our investment guidelines is discussed in Parliament every year and is open for everyone. That is, of course, to secure support from the Norwegian people in how we manage the fund, and, of course, to build trust in the markets. We have a very long-term horizons, and that is not only to stabilize Norwegian economy, but it's also now stabilizing the global economy. We have ethical guidelines for the fund, and that is to avoid that our investments contribute to unethical acts. We are exercising these ethical guidelines through our ownership rights, and we can exclude individual companies if they, for instance, produce nuclear weapons, cluster munitions, or landmines, or if they in some ways violate human rights or damage environmental. So far we have excluded 25 companies for these reasons. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let me turn, if I may, to Mr. Fuld. These people sound absolutely the ideal investors. How do you view them?
Well, the good news is we don't manufacture arms and guns. So, although occasionally we have been called brutal. But having said that, when you think about the sovereign wealth funds, they are in fact another pool of liquidity. You think about the hedge funds with leverage, they're about 5 billion. The private equity, 5 trillion. The private equity firms are about 1 trillion. Pension funds are 60 trillion, and U.S. mutual funds are about 10 trillion. The difference here, sovereign wealth are about 2.5 to 3 trillion, but they're highly concentrated, held by about 15 countries, and 5 of them actually are about 70%. But that's only part of the story. Each of the countries, sometimes the sovereign wealth is the only investing piece. Sometimes there are stabilization funds, international reserve funds, state-owned funds, pension funds. If they all got together, that 2.5 trillion would be closer to 10 trillion as oil continues to create surplus and exports for those countries, you're talking about closer to 15 to 20 trillion over the next 5 years. So the impact will be huge. The press clearly has highlighted this over the last number of months, given the number of financial institution investments, but altogether those are about 60 billion and a very small slice of what the sovereign wealth funds have to invest. When you talk about the capital markets, let's look at it in different ways. If you go to the standard metrics, number one, liquidity. If they invest huge pools of capital, that creates volatility. If they buy a company that's in a distressed situation, sometimes that can provide a floor that reduces volatility. If you look at liquidity, they add liquidity clearly, and that's what makes capital markets function. If you look at rates, if they buy U.S. governments or other country governments, rates go down. If they sell those to buy equities or something else or move to EMG, rates go up. If you look at value, interesting question, what is their cost of capital? And some would say it's lower than most people for those that are competing against them, and therefore they can pay a higher price. You look at a different lens, you talk about strategy. One can be total return, highest return. The other is a combination of return and home country benefit. That brings up some different questions, not that we should get into on this point, but let's just understand protectionism is not good for highly liquid capital markets. You look at allocation. It's about internal asset managers, external or direct investment. You look at different portfolio strategies. Is it aggressive, where they buy equities and high-yield debt, or is it more conservative, where they buy high-grade debt and governments? Then it's about geography. Is it about major economies, or is it about emerging markets? Then the last is the impact on the target. First is the government, and in those cases it brings up a number of issues. But as far as the target itself, they can be long-term investors. That's a lot better than some of the short-term throws for arbitrage traders or the hedge funds. They can stabilize a business cycle, and also if they're not activists, which most of them so far have not been, it's a highly desired investor. The real question, though, is given the huge amounts of money that they have to invest, all of the sovereign wealth funds will have to access the capital markets, whether it's about derivatives or structured product, because given that whether it's 2.5 trillion on its way to 10, or if it's 10 trillion on its way to 20, they need the capital markets to function, and the capital markets need that liquidity.
Thank you very much. How do you see it, Mr. Schwarzman?
Well, we come about this actually from the world of the practitioners, and we've encountered sovereign wealth funds as investors in our funds and actually investors in our firm. So this has been a 20-year kind of relationship, and it's almost amusing to see pools of capital that we've dealt with forever in a totally normal way now have a new name called sovereign wealth funds, where they're supposed to be it's an inherent threat that journalists write about regarding these pools of capital. In point of fact, we've seen them across a number of the businesses that we are in, where they invest with us, and they're among the most professional investors in the world. The difference of going to a sovereign wealth fund for money and going to a state pension fund in the United States, which is the largest source of money for a lot of the alternative investment activities, is veritably nothing. Our experience with the sovereign funds is that they're smart, they're long-term, they're highly professional. All they're looking for is to earn the highest rate of return with safety that they can. And in that sense, they're really model type investors. And what they've done for the system overall, and you've seen this quite recently, is they put money into the U.S. financial institutions and the Europeans that are having difficulty, whether those are the Citis, Merrills, UBSs, and so forth. They are the largest privately placed pool of capital in the world, and where would those companies be getting money from? And if they weren't getting those monies from the sovereign wealth funds to re-equitize themselves, then those institutions would be shrinking the capital that they're providing to their domestic economies and causing great difficulties for those domestic economies. So in that sense, the sovereign funds are doing a very good job. Now, we have a sovereign wealth fund as our largest shareholder. We went public last year, and the China Investment Corporation bought a 9.4% interest. Now, it was quite interesting, and I guess has been reported in the press. What were their motives, and how did they do this? And it's indicative of the way a sovereign wealth fund would think. The first thing about that investment is that it is a non-voting investment, and that was important for them. We had originally asked them to vote with us, and they said, we'd rather, just sort of not vote. They don't have a representative on our board. They're not trying purposely to influence our activities, and they also are a long-term shareholder. And this is almost prototypic of the way a sovereign fund would interact with a business like ourselves.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to you, Larry Summers. Well, what we've heard so far is we want the oil. The market sets the price, obviously. They get the surpluses. They invest it long term. They're essentially passive investors. They provide pools of liquidity and capital for our markets. So there's absolutely no reason for any of the hysteria we've seen in recent months in recipient countries. How do you respond?
There's rarely a reason for hysteria, but there are some important issues. I think the first thing to say is that for anyone with a vast long-term pool of capital without immediate liquidity need, it would be malpractice not to seek to move out the risk-return spectrum and get higher returns by taking more risk. It's the right thing for the countries to do. It's the right thing for the world to encourage. There is a question, it's not our question today, not with respect to the commodity producers, but with respect to some of those who've accumulated their funds heavily through intervention in the foreign exchange market, whether that type of activity should be encouraged as part of global surveillance. But that's not our topic. Today. And I would agree that the world is a better place because of the transactions that have taken place in the last 3 months than it would be without those transactions, and a better place because it was possible to undertake those transactions. And I would agree with the broader judgment that there's not much in what sovereign wealth funds have done to date that one can be very critical of. I am surprised, given that there is such aversion among sovereigns to the notion of defining a set of practices that would be problematic if undertaken, because it seems to me that such an effort would provide a kind of safe harbor that would be insulating with respect to the criticisms that have taken place. That said, I do think there is potential ground for concern here. In the United States, rightly or wrongly, but with quite a bit of consensus, I think I didn't follow the moderator's instruction. Rightly or wrongly, but with quite a bit of consensus, we have made a decision that our National Social Security Trust Fund is not going to be invested in anything other than U.S. Treasury bonds. And the reason for that decision is because there's a feeling that if you get the government involved in making private investments, the risks of politicization and problems are too great And so we're better off accepting the lower returns that come with investing in Treasury bonds. Given that we have made that decision, that we're not prepared to invest our country's government's money in companies because of risks of politicization, it is not absurd to have certain concerns about the possibilities when other countries' governments invest. I think the concerns fall in three broad categories. The first is corporate governance. Some people's model investors are other people's version of 1-800-entrench. What could be better for not entirely secure management that doesn't have the option of family ownership of the manager's family than a long-term, non-voting shareholder who, if they were to decide to threaten to liquidate, would get murdered in the press and get murdered politically. So past a certain point, there are corporate governance issues. The second set of issues is what I would call multiple motive issues. It's the premise of capitalism that people invest and own companies in order to maximize their value. But if you think about a national ownership of a stake or of a company, or for that matter, if you think of a direct, non-intermediated investment made by a U.S. state pension fund, where very much the same issues would arise, there could be multiple motives. Perhaps we want the airline to fly to our country. Perhaps we want the bank to do extensive business in our country. Perhaps we want suppliers from our country to be sourced. Perhaps we want some disablement of a competitor for our country's national champion. There are multiple motives possible, and when there's no assurance that value maximization is not being pursued, there is a potential question. The third area that I would cite as reason for concern and reflection is what I would call general politicization. And I would give two examples. First, suppose that a country ran an active trading operation. And suppose it was a very inspired, a very inspired active trading operation, and it found itself in an investment much like George Soros's short position in the pound in 1992. Would we be comfortable with the concept that the nation of X had decided that that nation of Y's fixed exchange rate was untenable and launched a massive speculative attack against it? I think that's not conducive to successful relations between nations, and there should be some kind of understanding that that's not going to happen. Here's a second, more difficult example. The sovereign wealth fund of country A makes an investment in a major bank in country B. The bank gets in big trouble. There's a question as to whether investors are going to be bailed out. Is there any country in the world that can assert confidently that when there are billions of dollars on the line, their head of state and their foreign minister are not going to become involved in the negotiation of that transaction? And do we think that kind of thing is healthy for modern markets? So the question isn't whether we should have sovereign wealth funds. They're terrific. The question isn't whether we should be against them because they're foreign. That's terrible. The question is, if we believe in market economies, and we've worked very hard to create much larger markets, much more private enterprise, shouldn't we have some concerns and some set of understandings established in some way with respect to transactions that have an element, albeit a very small element, of cross-border nationalization?
Okay, that's the challenge. Bob, how do you see it?
Martin, thank you very much. The starting point for our analysis in the U.S. government is the U.S. commitment to open investment. We believe that the free flow of capital across borders based on open investment policies is as important an element to a healthy U.S. and world economy as are free trade and flexible exchange rates. To this point, the history of sovereign wealth funds is that they have been seeking higher investment returns, that is, to generate those higher returns without generating political controversy. They're patient, long-term investors, not highly leveraged, unlikely to change their asset allocation in the wake of short-term volatility. And importantly, both fund management and investment decisions to this point have been made on commercial and not political grounds. We welcome that type of investment, whether it be from a sovereign wealth fund or anybody else who wishes to invest in the United States. Investments, of course, are subject to regulatory review on a non-discriminatory basis, whether they're sovereign wealth funds or any other investor. If a national security issue might arise or does arise, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., under the new Foreign Investment National Security Act passed last summer, will conduct its normal review. But again, this would be done for investment from any source. So we welcome such investment. We don't fear such investment. However, the growth in the size and number of sovereign wealth funds is such that vigilance is required. And that's why at the bank fund meetings last fall, the G7 hosted an outreach dinner with the sovereign wealth funds, together with the IMF, the World Bank, and the OECD, to begin a multilateral dialogue on this subject. And the G7 specifically asked the IMF, working with the World Bank, to work with the sovereign wealth funds to develop a voluntary set of best practices, including on a number of the issues that have been raised, governance, transparency, and other matters that could make clear the continuing commitment of sovereign wealth funds to invest on commercial and not political grounds. But recipient countries, destination countries, also have their own set of responsibilities, and therefore the G7 asked the OECD, based on the decades-long work that they've done on open investment policies, to work with recipient countries to set out standards that make clear that investment from sovereign wealth funds made on a commercial basis is welcome across the spectrum of recipient countries. We expect that these two work streams, IMF, World Bank on the one side, OECD on the other, will report back at the time of the spring bank fund meetings, and hopefully the work will be concluded by year's end at the fall meetings.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to ask a few of the participants to respond to what's been said, particularly the people who spoke at the beginning representing the funds, before I turn the floor over to you, because I'm sure you all have questions. May I start with you, Mr. Kudrin, because I think your remarks were particularly pointed about the US reaction at the moment. I think you used, at least in the translation, the word protectionism. I may have got that wrong. Larry Summers has spoken of general concerns and the obligation on the owners of the funds, the managers of the funds, to be transparent, to have clear codes of practice and the desirability of that. And Mr. Kimmitt has spoken in similar ways. How do you respond to what they've said? Is there anything from your point of view that you think that they're saying that is legitimate? And how does that affect the policy of Russia?
Я бы отметил две части моего ответа. Первое. Сейчас мы имеем быстро растущие экономики, с одной стороны, накапливающие эти существенные крупные ресурсы, и с другой стороны, традиционные экономики, которые накапливают дефициты своих торговых балансов и бюджетов. У нас складывается некий дисбаланс, и мы видим, что свободное передвижение капитала способствует преодолению этих дисбалансов и способствует общей стабилизации. Я очень опасаюсь любых разговоров или мер ограничения, которые могли бы снизить эти потоки капитала, потому что это бы усилило проблемы и дисбалансы. И когда был период, когда эти традиционные экономики имели существенные ресурсы и через разные фонды, частные, государственные, пенсионные, страховые, вкладывали эти средства в рынки третьих стран и покупали крупные предприятия, покупали целые отрасли. Мы не говорили о необходимости ограничений. Когда эти ресурсы стали накапливаться в странах с быстрорастущими экономиками и теперь готовы инвестироваться, в том числе частично, очень небольшой частью, в прямые инвестиции, мы получили очень серьезную дискуссию по поводу целесообразности и возможности таких инвестиций. Очевидно, что идет речь о распределении экономической власти, экономических позиций. Но это одна часть. И мне бы хотелось, чтобы реальное объективное развитие событий не ограничивалось в рамках экономик США или Европы движением капитала. Но есть вторая часть, которая заслуживает также внимания. Это прямые иностранные инвестиции части фондов. Я уже сказал, что 40% примерно по большинству фондов вкладываются в акции. В основном это финансовые инвестиции, портфельные. Как правило, они очень диверсифицированы. И только несколько фондов в последнее время позволили себе прямые инвестиции в крупные пакеты акций. По-видимому, это и является сегодня предметом обсуждения. Пока, как я понял, нет опасений, пока ни одна сделка, по-видимому, не вызвала опасений, но такие опасения возникают в будущем. Тогда я хотел бы, чтобы мы разобрались, в чем могут быть такие политические мотивы или в чем мы видим опасность таких мотивов. Потому что если мы будем определять проблему национальной безопасности, то у нас будет другая дискуссия совсем. Какая инвестиция в экономику или в крупное предприятие США создает опасность или угрозу национальной безопасности? И дискуссия будет совсем другой. Будет дискуссия покупка британской компании по крупным портам в США, известной компании Dubai Port World, являлась серьезной угрозой для Соединенных Штатов. Являлась такой угрозой, которая требовала Конгрессу и администрации остановить эту сделку. Или не являлась. И здесь даже мы видим, что позицию администрации США и у Конгресса были разные по этой сделке. Сначала эта сделка была разрешена, и в ней не было найдено никаких угроз. Но то, что это арабская компания, вызвало политические страхи, которые были связаны также еще и с выборами. Поэтому давайте разберемся, что создает угрозу национальной безопасности. И тогда потом вернемся к проблеме фондов.
Thank you very much. I'd like to actually just ask Mr. Al-Saad, because you have been in business for so long, whether you feel, and you've had quite significant shareholdings, as you mentioned, in very well known in my country. How do you respond to some of the concerns that have been expressed? Do you feel that there's anything legitimate in these sorts of concerns? And how should they be dealt with? What sort of deal agreements might make sense from your perspective, if any?
Sure. Let me first explain. All what I mean, with all the respect that we heard, still is all about if and suppose. There is not a real case that we can build about. If we want to talk about national security, when Dubai ports acquired the P&O, the ports was an issue in the United States, but it hasn't been an issue in Canada. It hasn't been an issue in UK. So even the national security, it's it is a difference between a country to another country. The other case, let's talk about the sterling case. Have we ever seen a 20, 30 time a sovereign wealth fund which has been leveraged 20, 30 times, and it has a forced sale in any currency that force the central bank to devalue the currency? This only has been in the hedge funds. So still all this fear is about if and suppose, nothing realistic. It's the interest of our social stability is to be a long-term investor and not to take a short-term volatility play. Thank you.
I would actually like to go to the floor now, but if one of the panelists wishes to respond very, very quickly to what's said, then I'll have to give the floor the opportunity to add. Wait a second. Larry, very quickly.
I'm baffled by why the sovereign wealth funds don't get together and put an end to all this discussion by agreeing on some piece of paper that says we're under no circumstances going to speculate in currencies. We're always going to be a long-term investor. We're never going to use our sovereign wealth fund to pursue any national political objective, and list 5 principles to which you're going to abide, say you've never done otherwise, and you've now been prepared to state your intention not to do the things that raise concerns in the future. And that's, I guess the unwillingness, the argument of the form, we've never done X, therefore it would be the end of the world if there was any effort to force us to agree in the future not to do X, is not wholly reassuring to people who are worried about X.
I knew I could rely on Larry to ensure that this will be an interesting discussion. Mr. Jasser. Yes, of course.
I think, to Larry's point, I think, as I said, it's like motherhood and apple pie. But the problem with this is basically we're trying to address a hypothetical situation. We are talking about how to preemptively regulate something that may happen. We've had, for example, a lot of resistance to regulating the hedge funds and the rating agencies, even though there were failures galore affecting the global economy. And yet, no, don't do that because you may affect the smoothness of the operation of the market economy. Let's be a little bit more balanced.
Mrs. Halvorsen.
Just a short comment. I think that we would very much appreciate if we could have some common rules or behavior from the sovereign wealth fund. But when that is said, I think that we have managed and succeeded from the Norwegian pension fund to stress that we are a financial investor, that we have a very high degree of transparency. And your example, Mr. Summers, would never be possible in Norway. It will never be a topic or an issue for any foreign minister or prime minister or finance minister of Norway if a bank where we have investments is bankrupt. That is handled by those who are managing the fund, namely the central bank.
As I understand it, when the Norwegian fund was short a set of Icelandic banks and the government of Iceland became concerned, was your position one, did the ultimate play out reflect the fact that the judgment was made entirely financially, with nothing to do with political relations between the two countries?
Yeah.
Bob wanted to say something, and he has to be allowed to say it. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to respond.
I would like this to go on for another hour at least, but unfortunately I can't do it.
I'd like just to respond to my friend Aleksey Kudrin on U.S. investment policy, particularly the national security angle. I can't perhaps be quite as brief as Minister Halvorsen, but let me take a minute and no more. The new law, the new investment review law that was passed last July and was further implemented by the issuance of an executive order just yesterday by President Bush, strikes this important balance between encouraging open investment and protecting national security. It also has struck a better balance in the relationship on investment review between the administration and the Congress. And since Dubai Ports World, which was 2 years ago this month, we have had over 200 cases come through the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, many from state-owned and controlled companies and entities, even from some Russian private entities. None of those has been blocked, none of those over 200 cases. And I might just note more broadly, in 2007, there were roughly 2,000 cross-border M&A transactions in the United States, and fewer than 150, or roughly 7%, came before the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. So even the National Security Review is still the decided exception rather than the rule. Having said that, we were the ones who suggested that the OECD take a look at our and other recipient country investment policies. If there are adjustments that we can make to better strike that balance between open investment and national security, we're open to it.
Thank you. I'll take probably 3 questions together, and I'll manage how they're going to be asked and who they're going to be addressed to. Say who you are and make it very brief. This gentleman here.
Hi, Andy Critchlow, Middle East Managing Editor for Dow Jones Newswires. This is a question for Mr. Kimmitt and the rest of the board there. The legislation that you mentioned, did that take into account ADIA's involvement in BCCI? It seems that the West's desire for sovereign wealth fund investment is selective. BCCI was alleged to be involved in terrorist funding. Abu Dhabi backed that bank heavily with millions of dollars, and an investigation was kind of inconclusive about where that went. It seems that the legacy of BCCI was very quickly forgotten when America's largest bank needed a cash infusion urgently from Abu Dhabi last month.
I get the point. Gentleman here. You can deal with that. Do you want to deal with that?
I'm Mike Johnston from the United States, and I'm with the Capital Group companies. We manage money for 7 sovereign wealth funds, and the people represented here today, I think, are very responsible. But in picking up on Larry Summers' admonition that perhaps there ought to be a best practices, and the best people to do that would be, in fact, the responsible sovereign wealth funds. Couldn't we imagine a time in the future when a country that is not necessarily good relationships with the United States, let's pick Venezuela for one, wanted to do something with their money that was outside of these best practices? The fact the best practices existed would certainly give ammunition to those who wanted to say to Venezuela, this is not acceptable behavior. In other words, since we have such a good base of history with responsible sovereign wealth funds, isn't this the time to, in fact, bring out those best practices?
This lady here. I'll take one at the back, and they're going to answer in 1 minute each. Okay.
Catherine Bennett from the International Herald Tribune. It seems to me that the West, and particularly the United States, being in need of capital right now, may not have enough leverage to really enforce the need for this best practice. So my question very directly to Mr. Kudrin and Mr. Al-Sad, and perhaps Mr. Al-Jasser as well, is what would it take for you? What would the West have to put on the table for you to agree to this best practice? Is there a grand bargain possible?
Okay. Very briefly on ADIA and BCCI. Did we learn the lessons?
Well, I can't comment on any individual case or investment, but let me just say the statute to which the questioner referred says that we're to look at any investment in which the investor is taking ownership or control. There's generally a presumption of no control if it's under 10%. But if a case comes before us for review, we look at the full range of national security considerations, and that would include the integrity of the global financial system and keeping illicit finance out of that system.
I think the other 2 questions really go together very closely, so I'll start with you, Mr. Kudrin, if I may. Can you imagine any benefit in having such a code of practice for governing how, in some sense, sovereign funds ought to behave? And is there anything that the recipients could do, offer, or should do or offer, for instance, a code of practice on their own part about what is a strategic industry, which would persuade you, your country, to participate in such a thing?
У нас интересный разговор. У нас вроде не признано пока никаких негативных действий фондов, но мы должны создать кодекс от возможных каких-то ситуаций, которые пока мы еще не определили, в чем они состоят. Поэтому сейчас, наверное, мы забегаем вперед, когда говорим о кодексе. Давайте определим, что может вызывать беспокойство. Не вызывает беспокойство вложение крупным фондом инвестиций в контрольный пакет. Это само по себе не является еще причиной для выработки правил. Давайте определим, что должно быть таким предметом дискуссии. Это национальная безопасность. Давайте определим, что это мы имеем в виду. Мой друг Роберт говорил здесь о законодательстве США, и я хочу отметить, что комиссия по иностранным инвестициям США не имеет четких критериев, что наносит ущерб. Это принимается по каждому случаю в виде комиссии, и такое решение может быть индивидуально для каждой компании. Это новая практика, она, по сути, с лета прошлого года приобрела новый масштаб, но для нас также не всегда понятно, по какому принципу будут приниматься эти решения. То есть мы должны заранее ожидать по каждой сделке индивидуального решения. И потом успокоиться, когда услышим, что вроде эта сделка не вызвала беспокойства для безопасности США. Вот пока что у нас есть неопределенность в этой сфере.
Mr. Al-Assad, would you just on that question, are there any circumstances in which you think a deal of some kind might be done in which there is a general agreement on the side of the investors? And what would they expect from the recipient countries in return, if anything?
Sure. I don't think the problem with the code of practice. I think each country has to define what's the sectors that has or what sectors considered as a national security. So this is because this is differ from each country. Also, we have to define the code of practice. Let's talk about transparency. What do we mean by transparency? Should we announce each transaction before we invest? Should we announce the size of the fund? I mean, let's define what's transparency. So still, I think there is some fake about the code of practice. I totally agree with the minister about the definition of the code of practice. Thank you.
Mr. Jasser.
I will agree with Larry Summers on one point, at least 1 point. I think, yes, the sovereign funds, the countries that represent them, I think it will be worth their while to discuss these concerns and to allay the concerns in some way. However, I think to the question that was raised, what would it take and all of that, it's really the wrong question. I mean, it's like putting the cart before the horse. It's like the sovereign wealth funds are guilty until proven innocent. And I think this is really the concern for this panel and for this audience, is that are we really creating a straw man before we destroyed it? We have to be careful.
Mrs. Halvorsen.
Just a very brief comment. I think that we would benefit, all of us, if we could agree on a common code of practice. And I think that transparency, for instance, means that our investment strategy is public, and also that which companies we are invested in is public. We make that public once a year, all the 7,000 companies where we have investments. And I think that would calm the audience down a bit, because now it seems that they don't like us, but they need our money.
Mr. Fuld, you have minus 10 seconds.
Then I'm finished. Thank you very much. No. On the one hand, clearly I am a protector not only of U.S. national security, but I think in all fairness, every other country's national security issues. But on the other side, I am clearly a free marketeer. Given the electronic connectivity today of all exchanges, we are really creating a global capital market. And the most important issue is that money today has the right to move to the highest returning asset. So I very much appreciate Larry's ideas of rules for sovereign wealth funds, but the truth of the matter is it goes beyond that. It goes to all investors. Let's have a similar set of practices for all investors, not just single out the sovereign wealth funds, because these are issues that go not just to the funds, but also to companies within some of these individual countries. So if we get to a level playing field for that, you will get to a much freer flowing state of capital from one country to the next.
I've got to stop this, Larry, so can you make your point in really 10 seconds?
I'm going to ask a question.
Which you won't get an answer to.
All right, well, let everybody think about it.
Ask the question.
I'll ask my question of sovereign wealth funds. That imagine the sovereign wealth funds that have just invested in financial institutions. If they placed a phone call to the chief executives of those institutions in which they said, we're trying to develop our capital city here as a major financial center. We have no control right, we recognize that. We would really like it. We bailed you out when you were in real trouble. We would like you to make a significant commitment to activity in our city. Is that a legitimate practice by a sovereign wealth fund? Is that something that everybody's sure they would never do? If it's something they're sure they would never do, why aren't they prepared to simply say that it's something they would never do?
I have now been told I would like this to go on forever, but I have to stop it. In fact, I'll probably never be invited back as a moderator because I've run over by 3 minutes. But thank you very much. A wonderful discussion. Wonderful discussion. Thank you very much.